speaking of, budget season, you wrote a really insightful article a few weeks ago about budgeting. And one of the first steps, as you described, was kind of setting an established budget. And you talked about zero-based budget, you talked about run rate budgeting. Can you talk a little bit more about, I'm assuming the first step is the pull, the data out of the ERP, but then what's next?
Yeah, I mean, really, whether you're going with zero-based or run rate budgeting, you have to establish a baseline.
Okay.
Otherwise, you're going to be putting a lot of work on the budget owners. That baseline can come from the ERP, meaning you can just look at where you're spending money today, who are the vendors, which suppliers, and how much money did you spend. But often that's lacking information that you ultimately need, because what you really need to understand is contract start dates, end dates, obligations. You may have expenditures that you can action next year, meaning, and when I say action, I mean you could contract, you could expand, you could churn that particular supplier, and
So,
you
so there's,
have
there's some that you can't though, right? There's some that are locked in. There's some that you can. Is
and
that what
there's
you're saying?
others
Yeah.
that you can do nothing about. You're obligated to spend, and that's not obvious in the ERP. So you need a tool
Okay.
that can give you that accurate baseline.
Very interesting. And I think that probably a lot of companies have access to, you know, simple metadata like that. But what are you maybe digging a little bit deeper? Are you looking for historical trends to kind of figure out like what your spend run rate is, or maybe share some thoughts there?
Historical trend is relevant. I mean, especially if you're seeing sequential increases in user count, seat count. It depends on the pricing model for the particular supplier, whether or not history is a good proxy. But history could also show you that a supplier has a pattern of every year or every other year increasing pricing by 10 to 15%. So the historics are useful in that regard, but not just historics.
Okay. So beyond historics, let's keep going.
Yeah. So what would be even more interesting to understand is what are the trends in the marketplace around that supplier? Are we seeing the supplier is changing their pricing strategy? Are they differentiating from just a per seat or per user model over to a consumption or transaction model? And do we need to factor that into our budget process? Are they rolling out new capabilities that today are free or embedded in your current subscription, but in the future they're going to start charging for it? So really, the need to be out in front of all the different ways that suppliers are innovating. And the reason is they're all undergoing market pressure, contraction. People are looking to trim budgets. Well, they still have to grow revenue. So suppliers are looking for ways to grow revenue. Pricing strategy is one of those ways. And so the budget process intersects very specifically with pricing strategy.
And historically, has that data beyond the historical trends, has that data been easy to get?
No, that data is not easy to get.
So how are you getting that data today?
I get that data from Tropic.
Okay. And has that been impactful then?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting because at our fingertips is all of this information about how much we're spending, how much we used to spend, when our contracts are up, uh, which ones we can action in the following year, where are we spending too much money, where can we save money, negotiation strategies. It's really a gold mine of insights for someone trying to save money for a company.
Well, and it's not just saving money. Obviously, that's really important, but I have to imagine that in this market specifically, being able to come up with an accurate budget is probably more important than it's ever been. And so, what I hear you saying is historically, maybe if companies looked at historical trends, maybe they've looked at, maybe some utilization data if they get their hands on that, but that doesn't tell the full picture. What really to be able to control your costs, to be able to, forecast accurately, you need to understand what's changed externally, the supplier pricing, the uplifts, the packaging changes, and then probably combine that with knowing what price is even competitive? Because just because you've paid a certain price historically doesn't mean that that's what you should be paying. So maybe a follow-up question, as I'm kind of speaking out loud here. At this point in the budgeting process, are you focused on, starting to evaluate competing solutions at this point, or are you just really trying to look at the incumbents from a supplier perspective?
No, we are looking at the alternatives, but also tech stack consolidation opportunities. But going back real quickly, another thing to consider is suppliers often do this true up thing where you pay for a certain number of seats or users or at a certain level of consumption, and they don't charge you differently during the year. And then at the anniversary period, then there's an uptick. If you just
Yeah.
look back historically, you would not in your budget process capture that potential uptick unless you're using a robust enough tool that can flag that for you.
Because it would look flat, and what you're saying is the assumption would be that hey, if it's been flat, so it's probably going to continue to be flat, or maybe a small uptick. But what you're saying is there's kind of this like got you where you could potentially be way off if you have that kind of true up moment in your contract. Really
That's
interesting.
right. And that would be an embarrassing miss in the budget process. But to your other question, what I call tech stack rationalization is really it's running rampant because so many companies have gone through changes in leadership, changes in strategy, asynchronous work, the proliferation of tools running rampant. And so the upside is lots of opportunity for new tools to crop up. The downside is we see those tools enter a company's footprint either through purpose, like we intended to go acquire that tool, or people just stand them up on their own. And you do every year constantly need to review that to figure out where you can cut spoilage.
Yeah, this is reminding me of another point in your article. It was you called out the concept of reviewing levers and leakages, and
Yes.
so if I understood you correctly, it sounds like some companies are reactively adjusting on a quarterly basis, but if you're doing this right, and as much as you love fall and budgeting season, it should be more ongoing and proactive. So it made me curious. I was reading that, like, is that a change in an approach, or does it require more than that?
Well, the work has got to be done at either reactively or proactively. It's far more painful to react to a budget miss and find the team scrambling to cover a revenue gap or an expense overrun. Because when you do that, you force unnatural things on the business. Suddenly, you're reprioritizing, you're distracting the team from the core mission because you're trying to fill a budget gap. Better is to have a flywheel of ideas that you're constantly keeping warm
Yeah.
and that you're constantly ideating around. And those ideas are both revenue generation ideas and efficiency gain ideas. And the realm we're talking about is more squarely perhaps on the efficiency side, but they are definitely interconnected. And so it's really about keeping that list warm of those levers and leakages that you can pull.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think back to my own experience, as a procurement guy, but also working with finance. And I think one thing that's changed for me is that, you take these datas, you take the insights, you take the information provided about the new suppliers popping up, whatever. I really think that having that information from a tool like Tropic can really empower a procurement person, a finance person to not only bring ideas, but to maybe be a little more forceful. And I don't use that word in a negative way, but you're really coming from a position of knowledge and insight as opposed to just, hey, what if? Would you say that that's true?
Yeah, I think that the people using the tools naturally feel the pain of using multiple tools to accomplish the same task. But as you're going about your day-to-day work of just running the business, it can be a little bit out of sight, out of mind, or just accepted that this is how we do business. And so you would not want the budget process or the procurement process to be the instigation or the reason why you're rationalizing your tech stack, but
Sure.
it is a fantastic opportunity to do so. And it often is the main reason why a company looks under the hood and says, why are we using this tool? And are we getting out of this tool what we intended? Or what did we hire this tool to do? And is it accomplishing that? And are there other tools we're already paying for that can accomplish the same thing?
Yeah, I love asking those questions. I've heard you talk about that before, and really, I think sometimes, and I'm not saying you do this, and I'm not saying how, but I have seen it done where new spend is treated a little bit more differently than historical or renewing spend. And I think in this market, with as much as changed, with as the emphasis have changed from, focus on top line growth to obviously being very profitable as well, that, you really should question, hey, we've been using this tool for a long time, but is it, and to those questions that you were talking about, is it performing sufficiently? Is it giving us the ROI that we need? And that can really open your mind to maybe not. Maybe just because we've used it for a long time, that doesn't mean we should keep using it.
Yeah, I mean, some tools are just nice to have versus must have. And so we're trying to distinguish between the tools that were just nice to have but aren't actually serving the purpose in which we originally acquired them versus those that are absolutely mission critical to hitting the company goals and objectives.
That makes a lot of sense. So I guess what would be, just kind of wrapping this up, what would be one message that if you had a bullhorn and you were talking to the company as a whole, coming from finance, like, and you're going into budgeting season, and you're kind of hoping this is a big team effort, what is that one message that you want to kind of get out there that people need to know, hopefully people will understand?
Yeah, boy, what a high pressure question. But I would say stop doing things the old way, because the old way doesn't work. The old way is trying to manually track this in spreadsheets, or just giving budget owners a lump sum amount and say, spend to that amount, otherwise we don't care, like the hands-off approach. That doesn't work anymore. You need to leverage a tool like Tropic to manage the workflow process, to keep track of the contract start dates and end dates, to get a pulse on what the supplier trends are, to make sure you're getting a good price, to pull down all of the useful reporting that can help feed the budget cycle, to unlock those questions, those hard questions about, is this tool accomplishing what we want? The process is worth investing in. It will pay dividends in terms of time savings, cost reduction, but even more so, just strategy rationalization, which may be the most powerful output. And so retire the old way, step into the new way. Step into the new way with Tropic would be my recommendation, but I'm a little biased.
I hear you there. And the cool thing is, I've seen the troops rally, not just at Tropic, other companies. I've seen people say, okay, yeah, I get it. I want to help. I understand. Regardless of whether they're in finance or procurement, it's more of a team effort. But maybe just lastly, I thought of this way you're talking, the why behind that. Like, why, if I'm in marketing or I'm in engineering, or if maybe historically I've tended to say, hey, that's not my job. Why is that important for the company?
Because one way or another, we will be coming back to that leader and asking for funding. Inevitably what happens every budget cycle, the company wants to do more than it wants to fund. So then we have to go back to the drawing board and cut costs and figure out what we're not going to do. If everyone partners and does this process well, you will naturally unlock efficiencies that allow you to redeploy that capital into the growth part of the business. And so in that way, everybody actually wins. So even though it feels like it's requiring a little bit more of the requester or of the budget owner, on the backside of it, as you create that flywheel of levers and leakages, as you have better spend control and spend management, you are freeing up cash to spend on the things that everybody wants to spend money on.